Have thinking minds? How about you all? The moment has arrived. You are about to see the first season of The Finding. You are going to distinguish the evidences that the geometrical pattern the ancient Egyptians used to design their main proportions on architecture did exist. These traces, which not still are proofs, show us how the proportions of the geometrical pattern turn up. They are repeated through all the pharaohs' architecture that was built through 3,000 years in history along the Egyptian land. This video is the first part of the first chapter called The Evidences, and it condenses all data about the first half in ancient Egyptian history. I tell you again, try to enjoy the first part of the chapter, raising your interest to know further, and if it is so, make me know it on likes and subscribe yourselves on the channel, and please send me your comments so as to continue getting better and better, doing my best on this thrilling project. I will wait for you on the second half in this first chapter of The Finding.
The architecture of ancient Egypt has amazed us since ever. It took place during almost 3,000 years and was given expression to such different structures as the Great Pyramids in the Ancient Kingdom and the impressive temples of the New Kingdom. Disciplines such as the history of architecture or even the Egyptology have understood these monuments like buildings without an evident geometrical link among them. However, a thousandth culture that has maintained partly intact its writing, its sacred liturgy, and its textile dressmaking has also maintained a tradition in its monumental architecture since the times of the first pharaohs and expressed in the designs of each and every one of the constructions. Many scientists have tried to propose different geometrical principles which the ancient Egyptian architects could use in order to define the main proportions in their architecture. However, none of these researchers have been able to expose any specific pattern tool which, systematically applied throughout the history of the ancient Egypt, could define the basic geometry of every construction carried out by the pharaohs. This research has found the geometrical pattern which the ancient Egyptian architects developed in order to design their magnificent architecture. It is necessary to go up to the first great constructions raised by the first pharaohs in order to find this geometrical pattern. On one hand, it is about the royal tombs in Umelkap, and on the other, these sacred enclosures in Abydos, all of them linked to the lost city of Tinis. We can observe, when going deeply into the geometry of these constructions built during the first and second dynasty, that some of them respond to rectangles of width-length proportions 1:2 or 2:3. However, the proportions of some of these constructions respond to three very singular rectangles. Henceforth, the alpha rectangle of 1:162 width-length proportions, beta rectangle of 1:127 proportions, and beta prime rectangle of 0.5 by 1.27 proportions, which is simply the half length of beta rectangle. Therefore, the main proportions of all the real tombs at Umelkap and the sacred enclosures built 1 kilometer north during the first 300 years of the pharaohs' Egypt were designed above 5 rectangles. These buildings were the first greatest constructions in the history of Egypt, so it is logical to think that their design, so simple at first, had to be studied and discussed by the architects. It is hard to imagine the first pharaohs in the history of ancient Egypt considering something like, oh, alright, more or less this rectangle matches fine, so let's do something similar next to each other. But how can we know that this pattern really existed and that repetition of these proportions is not just a coincidence? The first steps will be to check that these proportions are repeated in all the rest of the pharaoh's architecture. Indeed, we are going to start an incredible trip through all the whole architecture built during almost 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history. The first architectural revolution appeared with the step pyramid of Neterhet in the 3rd dynasty, at the beginning of the 26th century BC. Going deeply into its geometry, we can verify the way Neterhet projected the geometrical pattern from the horizontal plane to the vertical one and used the 1/2 rectangle in order to define the relation among the north and south sides, its base, with its height, and the diagonal of the better rectangle in order to state clearly the east and west hanging sides. Besides, on the horizontal plane, the pharaoh himself used the better rectangle to limit the temple proportions of the pyramid, which was situated on its northern side. And again, he used the 1/2 rectangle to fix his famous perimetral wall of incomings and outgoings, making use of better rectangle to mark out the great ditch that fenced his architectural complex. After him, his two successors, Sekhemhet and Haba, followed his ideas and used the diagonal of this rectangle to design their step pyramids, although, unfortunately, we only can speculate about mere reconstructions, for the temple structures of the two pyramids have not been preserved. Starting out, the 4th dynasty, Snefru, the father of the famous pharaoh Khufu, Cheops for the ancient Greeks, built probably in its entirety the first pyramid with flat sides, the Pyramid of Meidum, based on an inner step structure. According to Egyptological works, the scope of the sides of this pyramid is 51 degrees and 50 minutes. These studies consider that this slope corresponds to a design, a right triangle based 11 and height 14. It is significant to check that its proportions is the same of better rectangle. It is to say 1 by 1.27. This pharaoh also used the better rectangle and the 1/2 rectangle on the design of his first valley temple in his bent pyramid, built in Dashur. Even more revealing, it is to examine how the better rectangle and the rest of proportions of the geometrical pattern were used by ancient Egyptians on the design of such outstanding pyramids and temples in the 4th dynasty, like the ones in the Pyramid of Khufu in Itha, his son Jedefre in Abu Rawash, or the temple in the Pyramid of Khafra. Similarly, the pyramidal complexes in the 5th and 6th dynasty continued applying this proportional design. Every pharaoh used the geometrical pattern in some way. It could be different from the design of his predecessor. In some cases, the architects added some other proportions to the original design, and in others, they used different proportions to define the very same sort of building. And so, all the pharaohs, without exception, continued this architectural tradition which had begun some time ago with their ancestors. The building of the Great Pyramid put an end to the ancient kingdom, and, after a first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom arrived, with its monumental architecture and the use of the geometrical pattern on its new constructions. Although the pharaoh's architecture in the Middle Kingdom is not the most famous of ancient Egypt, one of the most well-known temples of the pharaohs is the one that Mentuhotep II raised in Deir el-Bahri. Once again, studying deeply its geometry, we can observe how Mentuhotep II continued using the geometrical pattern on the design of his great temple, almost after 1,000 years since the construction of the first tombs in El Kab. And not only the geometrical pattern was used on his temple in Deir el-Bahri, but on the chapel in Abydos as well, near the tombs built by the first pharaohs. After Mentuhotep II, pharaohs like Senusret I kept on building using the geometrical pattern in order to design such well-known temples as the famous White Chapel of Karnak, that has the same proportions as the mysterious temple situated in Qasr el-Saga, belonging to the same dynasty, and on whose temple on the top of the hill of Thoth he used the geometrical pattern too. The predecessor of Senusret I, Amenemhat I, not only founded the 12th dynasty, but he recorded the pyramidal architectural tradition, almost 2 centuries after the last of this sort of constructions. After him, pharaohs like Senusret I, Amenemhat II, and Senusret III carried on using the geometrical pattern on the design of these architectural complexes, in the same way that the pharaohs of ancient kingdom had done. In fact, the last pharaoh, Senusret III, based the design of this great funeral place at Abydos on his sacred proportions. His successor, Amenemhat III, built one of the last great pyramids of the Middle Kingdom and the history of ancient Egypt.